Hello everyone and welcome back to Journal Auto YouTube channel. My name is Alex and today I will show you one of the cars I am using quite often. And I'm using it only for city driving or around the city, so not on long distances. So what we have here, it's a Volkswagen Fox 2007, but first registered in 2008. So it's a small city car developed by Volkswagen and built in Brazil starting with 2003 and imported in Europe starting from 2005 up until 2011. And this car was designed to replace the old Lupo. At the moment when it was launched, this car came with 3 engines. So you had a 1.2 naturally aspirated petrol engine developing only 55 horsepower, and this is the engine that you are nowadays finding it most often in the market. It also came with a 1.4 diesel developing 70 horsepower and also with a 1.4 naturally aspirated petrol engine developing 75 horsepower, and that is the engine that this car is having. This is a much rare engine on the market because being developed to be not only a city car but a cheap car, let's say. Of course, most of the people chose the basic engine, the 1.2 naturally aspirated petrol engine. This car, I'm owning it for almost 6 years already, and this car, it's a very nice car for beginners or for those who need, let's say, a cheap and reliable transportation, because you can nowadays, I'm filming this in 2024, you can nowadays find this car with a very low price on the used car market, and it's one of those few cars that are cheap and reliable. And I will tell you how much I paid for different stuff during this 6 years. So I'm telling you from now because it's not that much. Of course, it's an old car. This car is almost 17 years old already. But hey, if you want cheap, reliable and a new car, I don't think that's its very realistic expectation. Of course, if you want a cheap and reliable car, you can find one like this one, but it will be an old car. Nevertheless, it's a perfect car for beginners. It's a perfect car for those who need basic transportation from A to B. It's a perfect car for those who don't have high expectation. They just need a car, cheap, reliable one, to just go around where they need. During these 6 years, I cannot say that this car drove a lot of kilometers, because up until now we only drove 42,000 kilometers with it, so that's an average of around 7,000 kilometers per year. But in the past 3 years, this car did only 5,000 kilometers per year. But starting with this year, we started using it intensively again, and we already put 3,000 kilometers on the clock in just 3 months. We have been very happy with this car despite its flaws, but because you will see later that this car has its own flaws, and there are several flaws, and you'll see a lot of cost cutting in this car. And that it's a little bit weird, because when Volkswagen launched this car, they wanted to not only to have a city car replacing the Lupo, they wanted to have a cheap car, a low-cost car. So when this car was launched in 2005, so almost 20 years ago, the starting price was around 10,000 euros. Nowadays, when we think of 10,000 euros, for many of us it would seem indeed a very low price for a new car. But imagine that back then, in 2005, you had the Dacia Logan, which was a bigger car, a much bigger car, also a low-cost car, that was starting from around 6,000 euros. So 4,000 euros less than this Fox. Bigger car. Many would say that, okay, but the Logan was not that safe. Well, back in 2005, if I recall correctly, the Logan got 3 stars at Euro NCAP, and this Fox, if I recall also correctly, got also only 3 stars. So 10,000 euros starting price was quite a lot, and that was for the 1.2 naturally aspirated petrol engine, without air conditioning, maybe without even electric windows. If you are adding options, of course the price would have been very, very high for such a small car, and with a lot of low-cost compromises. But nevertheless, despite all these, this Fox proved to be a very reliable car and a very cheap to own car. And I will show you a little bit later some expenses that I had with this car. This is the 1.4 naturally aspirated petrol engine, and this engine you can also find it from Volkswagen's Golf from that generation, the 4th generation, the 5th generation, and also the Polo, the 4th generation. And this engine, developing 75 horsepower, was very known for oil burning. Just that in the case of this car, there is a little difference. On the Polo and Golf 4 and Golf 5, that engine had 16 valves. This engine on the Fox has only 8 valves. And curiously, this engine with 8 valves, this version of the engine, because they're basically almost the same engine, this version of the engine in 8 valves has no oil burning. In all those 6 years of owning this car, I never had to fill it with oil, except of course when we did the annual oil changing. Never. It has 0 oil burning. Coming back to those cost cutting features, you can most probably see that here under the hood there is no covering for noise reduction. However, this car doesn't really need a covering for the noise reduction, because the engine is not noisy at all. In fact, up until 90 to 100 kilometers per hour, you can barely feel it. Of course, at higher speeds, the engine will become noisy because it's a naturally aspirated engine and the torque will be high. But up until 90 kilometers per hour, it is quite silent. In fact, when you are, let's say, waiting at a traffic light, you can barely hear the engine. It's almost like an electric car. Regarding the expenses in this car, I paid around 60 euros for the ignition plugs, so very cheap. I also changed the timing belt, but that was 4.5 years ago, and not only the timing belt but the whole system here. And that cost me back then around 200 euros, so very, very cheap. And I also changed the coil pack, which is a quite usual problem in naturally aspirated petrol engine. At one point you still have to change it. And the coil pack was also around 60 euros, and it was made in Brazil, just like the car. So this car was imported from Brazil. Curiously, this car, 17 years old, has almost no rust. We know that the Passats from that period, the B6 generation, and the Golfs, the 5th generation, had a serious issue with rust. Not this one. Not this little boy made in Brazil. So, 17 years old, and the only rust I found, it's here under the hood. So nothing seriously, otherwise there is no rust at all in the whole car. Regarding the fuel consumption of this engine, many people would expect to be very low because it's a small engine and a small car, right? Well, it's not like that. For example, 4 years I lived in the capital city of Romania, which is a very congested city, many times appearing in the tops of the most congested cities, not only in Europe but in the world. So when the city was not that congested, meaning on national holidays and the night, because otherwise it was always congested, the fuel consumption of this car was around 9 liters per 100 kilometers. And on the screen I will make you the conversion to UK and US miles per gallon. When the city was very congested, the fuel consumption was around 12 liters per 100 kilometers, so quite a lot. And now, since I have moved back in the countryside, the fuel consumption is around 7 to 7.5 liters per 100 kilometers. Okay, so if you live in a very big city, the fuel consumption will be quite high. But before getting scared, you need to know that this car is very reliable. The engine is very old and simple. So you would expect that being such a simple engine, there would be nothing, almost nothing to break, right? Right, it's true. So don't be scared of the fuel consumption. At least in my case, I prefer to pay a little more on gas than to spend my time in car repair shops with a diesel. There is no use to have a diesel in the city. When you are trying to buy a car, don't look only at the fuel consumption, but when you are calculating the running costs, also think of reliability. And a naturally aspirated petrol engine, a simple engine like this one, it's much cheaper to run than a diesel counterpart. So even if the fuel consumption will be higher, on the long run, you will still pay less on running a car with such an engine. And because I also said that this engine is not noisy at all, let's give it a hear to see that this is indeed true. Can you hear it? It's a very silent engine and it runs very, very smooth. No oil burning, very cheap to run, enough power to go around the city, and also even sometimes on longer trips. The only downside would be that, of course, if you go on the highway and run with 110 kilometers per hour, let's say, it will be noisy. Yes, it will be noisy, but as long as you use this car only around the city, it's a very cheap, reliable and honest, really honest car. But since we were talking about cost cutting, I will now close the hood and I will let you hear the horrible noise it makes when you close the hood. Just prepare yourselves. Horrible. This is how the Fox looks from the side, and my chance is that I have very nice wheels, original wheels, alloy wheels. I have a separate set of wheels for the winter that has plastic covers, but these are the summer wheels because here in Romania in April it's already almost summer. What I would have liked for it in Europe, it's for this car to have had 5 doors, because in Europe the Fox was offered only as a 3-door hatchback. Because of course you know that in case of the hatchbacks, the door of the boot is counted as a door. So it's not a 2-door car, it's a 3-door car. So in Brazil, this car was offered as a 5-door also, and it would have been helpful. But in Europe, Volkswagen decided to offer this car only as a 3-door, most probably in order to keep the cost as low as possible. But I don't think that was quite successful, because starting from 10,000 euros 20 years ago, and then if you add a lot of options, you would go very up. What was the difference to add another set of doors? Come on. However, this is what we had in Europe and we have to deal with it. But to say to you, to be honest, during these 6 years of owning this car, the moments where I had wished for this car to have 5 doors were few, very few in 6 years. Because the way we used this car, only for short distances, only to go shopping, only driving around the city, it was not necessary for us to have an extra set of doors. So for a beginner, for a young man, for a young woman, who of course at that age, let's say 18, 19 years old, doesn't have a family yet and so on, another set of doors, it's not that necessary. Especially if you use this car to go to school, to go to university, to go to shopping, or to move around the city. However, the front door, because it's only 3-door, it's very, very large. And despite being only 3-door, in the case of the Fox, what it's very nice is that the rear access, it's very easy. Of course, easy compared to other 3-door car, not compared to a 5-door car. But just look, so I'm 182 tall. That means, for those of you in UK, almost 6 feet tall. So 1 meter and 82 centimeters. This is the room you have to get in the back. So I will now get in the back and I will show it to you. Just, you saw how easy it was for me to get in the back, and I'm a quite tall person. Another thing, not only that, the access, the rear access, it's quite easy for a 3-door car, but there is a lot of room in here, just like Volkswagen used us during the years, because if there is something that I like on the brands of the Volkswagen group, and here I'm including not only the Volkswagen but the Škodas, I'm including Seats and so on, but especially Volkswagens and Škodas, is that they offer a lot of room with their cars being shorter than those of the rivals. For example, I'm taking the Golf as an example that has only 4 meter and 20 centimeters length. In the case of the 7th generation, I think it's 4 meters and 25 centimeters. And yet, despite being shorter in the case of the Golf than its rivals, it offers more room inside. And this is the case for the Fox. Of course, here in the back, you only have, here in the back seat, there are only 2 seats, so no 3 seats, because the car is very narrow. I put the driver's seat in my driving position, so being quite tall, it's quite pushed to the back, and I think you can see through here that I still have a lot of knee room, not counting the headroom. So it's very comfortable here, and it would have been a great car to travel here, even for longer distances, curiously, if it had another set of doors, if it had back doors. But you see, there is a lot of knee room for a car that small. Remember that this car is an A-class car, meaning a city car, so it's even smaller than a super mini, as you call it in the UK for the B segment. So it's an A segment car, and just look how easy it is for me to get out of the car and how much room I have to get out of the car, despite being quite tall, as I said. Ta-da! Because I talked a lot about cost cutting, we have a lot of cost cutting in this car too. Just look, it's hard and cheap and nasty plastic everywhere. Not that as cheap as the 1st generation of Dacia Logan, but it's not very far from it. However, compared to the Dacia Logan, the quality, it's a little bit better. And I'm saying quality, of course, I'm not referring of soft plastics, but everything is well made. Despite having a lot of cheap plastics, the build quality, it's okay-ish. So it's quite okay. This car has a lot of options. I saw that many Foxes on the market don't have they don't even have electric windows. This version of mine has electric powered windows, electric powered mirrors, heated mirrors, air conditioning, and a radio with MP3 for reading MP3 music. I didn't have this, not even in my Ford Mondeo back then. So it's very nice, and you will see that it's a very easy to drive car, and after almost 20 years it's still kept quite well. The only thing inside that it doesn't look that good is that the steering wheel, which is a plastic one, of course, now you can see that it has a lot of usage here. Maybe I will put an elegant and soft covering over it. And another thing is that despite having very, very small door pockets, you have a separate one for bottles, and here you can even put a 1.5 liter water bottle. So they're quite big. And another plus for this car, another thing that I like, is that the sound system is very good, and the bass, it's also very, very nice. Now let's have a look at the boot, and then let's go for a drive. During this video, one of the most important subjects were cost cutting, right? Well, we have another here. Before looking at the boot, you normally, in all normal cars, you usually have here a handle helping you to open the boot. But not in the case of the Fox. Why? Because cost cutting. I think this is the only car where I saw this. It may not be the only one, because I know that many Dacia models have also this thing. But you have only the button which you push, and to open the trunk you have only a little small handle here. So you do like this. Yeah, cheap. And of course, a lot of cost cutting here. You see a lot of metal, so you have a covering only here on the middle of the boot door, so not only on the whole door. Now, because I also told you that Volkswagens, in general, cars in the Volkswagen group, have a lot of room inside, the same thing applies to the boot. Remember that this is an A segment car in Europe, a city car, so smaller than a Super Mini in UK, smaller than a B segment car, and the boot has a capacity of 280 liters, which is a lot, because many cars in this class, they go around 200 liters or even less, like in the case of Citroën C1 or Toyota Aygo, the first generation. I'm talking about the first generation. This one, 280 liters. This has a bigger boot even than the Mitsubishi Colt from that era, which is again a B segment car and only has around 220 liter boot capacity. This one again 280 liter boot capacity. Just that you obtain this boot not through the length of it, but because it's deep. Now, you have a lot of space, but because it's deep, if you put in the boot something that it's heavy, it will be harder for you to take it off. For example, I have this box here, and maybe you can see that you can barely see it because the boot, it's very deep, and I will show it to you closer immediately. So if you take something from here, you need to be powerful enough to take it, because especially if it's something heavier. But as long as you put here your daily shoppings and so on, that shouldn't be a problem. And now let me show you the boot. This is the boot. You can see that it's quite deep, but if there is something that I like, and I don't see it nowadays quite often, it's that under the boot you can see a normal size spare wheel. Not only a spare wheel, because many cars nowadays don't even have a spare wheel, a normal size spare wheel, and some room under the boot, which is quite practical. And because we talked a lot, let's continue talking for a little more, but driving this car. So let's go driving it. We are now driving the Fox, and I'm doing it first on the country roads, just to confirm you what I have told you before. You can drive this car outside the city, but you need to know its limits. Why? Because this car has quite a lot of rolling. Don't get me wrong, as long as you drive this car in its legal limits, you will be safe. Without any doubt, you will be safe. But if you try to do sporty or rally driving, it's not for that. Look, we have here a turn. I have 75 kilometers per hour. It was okay. Not a big roll, not very sporty, not a big roll, but you need to know its limit. This car outside of the city, it has a lot of limits. Now I'm almost 90 kilometers per hour. Let's go, almost 195. The acceleration, it's quite slow. 100 kilometers per hour, 3000 RPM, and you can already hear the noise inside this car. So as I said, it becomes noisy at 90 to 100 kilometers per hour. And if you want to overtake, you need first to assure yourself that you have a lot of time, because the car is quite slow despite its 75 horsepower. When you accelerate, if you also have another person near you, you will feel it. If you are alone, it will be a little bit better. Now 50 kilometers per hour, we have a 90-degree turn. I felt safe, but again, I was around the legal limits. If you try to show yourself and to brag yourself with this car by driving it very sporty, then you are doing quite of a big mistake. You can drive it on country roads, you can drive it on highway, as long as you know its limit. And another problem is that taller persons can have a lot of issues with finding a good driving position. And this is because the car is quite tall. You feel yourself like you are in a little, nowadays, SUVs. But a person like me, almost 6 feet tall, in 6 years, I never found a very comfortable driving position. For example, like I'm driving now, my right foot doesn't feel very comfortable. If I push the seat to the back, I may find a comfortable position for my right foot, but in the same time, it will be very hard for me to reach the steering wheel and the clutch. So almost I will not be able to push the clutch pedal up to its end. It's okay, this problem with the right foot, it's okay as long as you don't drive it for a lot of hours daily. If you do it and you are a taller person, then you might have this issue. My wife, which is shorter, of course, she's not very tall, she tells me that she does not have this issue at all, and she feels very comfortable in the car. So a woman or a man that it's not that tall will find a comfortable position in this car very easily, but a taller person, it will be very problematic to find the ideal driving position. Now, inside the city, I'm not in a city now, I'm in a village, but imagine you're in a city, whatever. The car, it feels very nice to drive because it was made for this. This is the place it was made to be driven. The steering wheel, it's not very light as you would expect from a city drive. See, it responds to the slightest of move, but in the same time, the steering wheel, it's also not very sport, it's not very firm. So it's somewhere in between. So the steering wheel is very balanced. This is the word that you can describe it the best. Another thing that I like, and it's a proof that this car indeed was made for city driving and it's very lovable to drive it in the city, is the gearing shift. It's very easy to use it. Just look, I can move it with only one finger. Even with my little finger, I can move it. This is very useful inside the city where you change a lot the gears. Also, those 75 horsepower are more than enough inside the city because it makes the car up until 50 to 60 kilometers per hour quite fast. Of course, for a naturally aspirated petrol engine. You see, let's see, now we go to, let's say we are in the city in the third gear. Let's go to 40 kilometers per hour and then accelerate. It's okay. Compared to other city cars, it's quite okay. In the second gear, it's even faster. So if you want to drive in the city a little bit faster, if you hurry, you have enough power as long as you stay in the legal limits. So a very nice and pleasant car to drive as long as you don't get too often outside the city. So in the end, how it is after 6 years with this 1.4 naturally aspirated petrol Volkswagen Fox. Do I regret it? No, not one moment. I'm very happy that I bought this car. 6 years, very little issues. I mean, you saw in the end what I changed. You can't even call those issues. Those were not real issues. Those were, let's say, parts that you are getting at one point to change them. But otherwise, I'm very happy with it. I was thinking several times to sell this car, but for the moment we will not sell it. I think we will still keep it for 1-2 years, just because we are investing our money in something more valuable, and this car, it's a good car that we can still use it, and maybe in 2 years we will sell it, or maybe give it as an exchange for a new car. This means that it will get to the scrapyard. I will be sad if it will get to the scrapyard, to be honest. I think I would prefer to sell it or even donate it to someone else who can still use it, because despite being this old, and in 1-2 years it will be almost 20 years old, but despite being that old, this car, it's still reliable, it still works without any issues, at least without important issue, it's still cheap, and it's still a good friend that takes good care of your pocket. So I hope you liked this video, and let's hear each other in other videos too. All the best.